come to Science 10, and this is the 100th presentation in our 2-year learning cycle and ecology. And what we have been developing is something that is ancient but new in the way in which the very near future will be able to utilize it. It's ancient in the sense that the pilot light for our woken mind condition was in very ancient times based on nature, and that nature was the context. And one of the earliest ways in which to keep track for our kind of what was happening in life according to nature and in our cultures was counting. And counting can be called numeracy. And it's a matter of paleographic evidence that written numbers, numeracy, precedes literacy, written language, by about 4,000 to 5,000 years. And the origins for numeracy were business transactions, where you had to keep track of how many cows, how many bundles of this or that, how many of that. And the earliest numeracy are little tablets on clay that have little pictures of what it is, and then however many of those there are, that was the product of the transaction. The next development of that didn't come for several thousand years, because the transactions built in complexity fairly slowly for a long time. And then there came a period of like inflation where suddenly one was doing big business over larger distances, and those further customers ordering more things didn't speak your language, and they were also a little bit leery of padding the bill. So they would make little cutouts of the pictures of things, and they would put them into a clay envelope and seal that. So when the consignment got there, the person who would open that clay and shake out all the little things and count them and count the animals and count the bunches of things would know, yes, this is accurate. They're all here. Eventually, it was found that you could put the images of the little clay things on the outside of the clay envelope, and if you baked it, there was no way to fudge it because you would break it. And so you didn't have to do that. You didn't have to have an envelope. And this was the beginning of the little clay tablets that were the size of the palm of a hand. And it's the beginning of the metaphor that you got it. You grasped it. Here it was, and not only were there pictographs for the things, but there began to be pictographs for the number of the things, and that this raised it to a higher level so that only those who could now read numeracy would be able to understand what it was, and it became a little more complex, and finally it evolved into a literate context that emerged and ballooned out of the numeracy, and you began to have a literacy, and those pictographs, those glyphs, eventually had to be standardized more and more, and as they became standardized, they became abstracted, and finally it was realized that you were dealing with so many different items that you had to have some way then not to just have pictographs or glyphs, but the development of alphabets came out, that these were constituent elements that could be put together, these letters to make words, and the words phrases. And so the whole development of our mind was based in this kind of a way of emerging out of the ancient Paleolithic world into the Neolithic world of tamed animals, tamed plants, commerce that reached thousands of miles, not only thousands of people, but hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people. And so about 5,000 years ago, there was an enormous change in our kind on this planet, that the cultural basis of business had become so far extended and expanded, complexified, and it underwent a transform. And instead of having the Neolithic culture that had been around for, at that time, at least 7, 8, 9,000 years, you had the first developments of what we call higher civilizations. And about 3000 BC, you find civilization emerging, and one of the qualities of civilization is that its metric is based on written symbols that are read in the mind, so that the mind takes the written symbols and makes corresponding cognate images, so that you get the picture in the mind by reading the abstract words out of letters. And even today, when you're teaching little kids how to read, you tell them to make pictures in their minds from the words. See Jane run after the dog. And you will see Jane running after that dog in your own way, but you will have it as a picture in the mind, which, if you're not attentive, you will automatically take it to be the same kind of thing as the pictograph. And so mental images become identified as things in the world. They become the things themselves. And what's true is that this is not the case at all. The mental pictures will have a referentiality in existence, but while they are objective, they're not objective existentially. They're objective in terms of ideas. And that the pictures are held in a structure which is more powerful as an integral than the structure that holds things in the world together. So that the mind, when it is attentive to what it's doing, discovers that it is an index to things in the world, and not just the roundhouse where all the representations come together, but it can now index it. And by indexing it, it can not only see what the order is, but it can see how better to reorder. And by change and manipulation, one makes the world now in the images, ideas. And all this is natural, all this is an integral process. The difficulty came about 2,500 years ago. For the first time, someone, after about 2,500 years of higher civilizations, someone named Pythagoras went to study in ancient Egypt for 22 years. He studied in ancient Iran, Persia for 11 years. He had already mastered a great deal of the Ionic Greek world on the Aegean east coast, which is Turkey today. And he came back to his home, to the island of Samos, and spent some time there. Pythagoras was a watershed because he found that there is a way to order the mind so that the mind, instead of just being an integral index of the world and capable of rearranging the world so that it makes a new mental index, that the mind could be made clear by an ultimate order that would deliver a kind of a mind that the images did not stop there in the mind, but the mind was clear enough to be a window where one could see where those images might go in a precognitive way. And visionary consciousness, for the first time, was something that could be taught. And so wisdom schools changed. Instead of there being just an esoteric wisdom for the king or the pharaoh, so that he could hopefully have a successful dealing with the netherworld or the afterlife or the above world, all of a sudden it was available to be taught to anyone. Men or women, you didn't have to be royal. And all of a sudden, wisdom, which had been the purview for thousands of years of just the rare royals, now became available for people, for citizens, for men and women, by huge numbers. When Pythagoras finally moved to southern Italy, because things were getting hot and heavy at his home Samos, because all kinds of peculiar jealousies were coming up, all kinds of accusations. And the same jealousies and accusations came up in southern Italy after a while. And a number of Pythagorean communities were reviled as if they were like mutants and not really belonging with us anymore. They're dangerous people. And what's really dangerous about them is not only do they do these things, but they teach others in such a way that those others now do them even better. And the upshot was that within 3 generations of Pythagoras, the number one innovator in that technique of teaching wisdom to anybody was Socrates. And he was put to death by the state for 2 things that were related: for teaching young men not to believe in the gods of the state, but to find out for themselves what is divine. And 2, of a method of education by which they could out-argue all the experts, the sophists, who were supposed to be the experts and that the state counted on, that they had by contract or by pay or by coercion, they had all the experts, and no one could argue with the state then because they had the best expert advice. All of a sudden, there were, especially young men, by great numbers, who knew that these experts did not know anything themselves. The core to it was in a curious numeracy, which Pythagoras had developed and which initially went over the heads of almost everyone, but by the time of Socrates, it became a cause célèbre. And it forms the most formative early section in a new book by Roger Penrose, The Road to Reality. A guide, a complete guide to the laws of the universe. And we're interested in it because we're taking, as we usually do, a pair of books that are held together in a ratio. And one of them is by Roger Penrose and Stephen Hawking, The Nature of Space and Time. The other is QED, Quantum Electrodynamics, by Richard Feynman, The Strange Story of Light and Matter. And as usual, what we're doing is that if we took a book as a text, we would fall into any number of faulty traps, which can be specified to any degree now. By pairing them and taking them as a pair, we produce a resonant ratioing of two books now that lose their textuality and they become creative material. And especially when we realize that in behind the pairs of books, we have a third book, which is a year-long reading. A book journey which is spread out 5 or 6 pages every week for the 52 weeks of a year, so that we have actually not just a pair, but we have a third book behind, so that we have almost like in the I Ching, we have a trigram of books now, so that the ratio is very complex. It isn't just two things making a fractional ratio, but it's at least 3 things making a very complex kind of a ratioing, and that complex ratio does not stop as a fraction could in the mind, but it has the ability to develop itself obviously indefinitely, which means infinitely. One of the aspects that we have seen is that anything in the natural cycle can be characterized in a binary fashion, just like with computers. The ultimate binary is really 0 and 1. Either the gate opens or it doesn't. And by proliferating that, not only millions and billions, but trillions of times now, one can characterize almost anything in the integral world in that way, because one is limiting oneself to a finite expression that is able to be carried by a binary of 0 and 1. One of the difficulties that Pythagoras found, and Penrose points out in a very early, more than 1,000 pages before the end, is that there's a very big difficulty in the mind at this point. The difficulty is that everyone has heard from grade school education of the Pythagorean Theorem that the two sides of a right-angled triangle squared equal the third side squared. If this side is 3, squared is 9. If this side is 4, squared is 16. This side will be 5 and squared will be 25. The diagonal, the hypotenuse, squared, is always equal to the two sides squared. The difficulty comes in, and this is where wisdom comes in. An actual existential never appears statically, just simply as what one has designated. There's always a paired aspect to it, so that Pythagorean right triangle actually is 1/2 of a square. And if you put two Pythagorean right triangles together, and you make it the ultimate integer where each side is 1, 1 squared plus 1 squared should then deliver 2, but it doesn't. It delivers the square root of 2, and the square root of 2 is an irrational number. And so 2,500 years ago, it was conclusive. And the beginnings of modern science. Somebody at Caltech once said, we're all still Pythagoreans. One now has to have a new development that counting and numbers cannot just be integral numbers, but there is such a thing as going beyond that material integrality into a higher order, which then is said to be real. Not just natural, but real in the sense of supranatural. And that in real numbers, this is the way Penrose styles it. He says a Pythagorean catastrophe that all of a sudden, the Greeks, who loved the fact that they could be very specific and exact and balanced and symmetrical, all of a sudden it was demonstrable that there were many permanent aspects to reality that are not rational. And the immediate leap for people who were stuck in their minds is that then they must be irrational. And so the classical Greek mind became haunted by the possibility of irrationality. And of course, one gets very paranoid about this. One gets not only neurotic about this, but one can get quickly psychotic about this. And so whole new civilized forms had to be made to exorcise the irrational ghosts that were lurking. And this is the origins of Greek tragedy. It's also the origins of Greek comedy. And it's also the origins of the philosophic dialogues. Because there are three ways of getting outside of yourself. One is through the ecstasy of Aphrodite, which turns out to be comic. Another is through the terror of war, which is Mars, Ares. And a third is the high wisdom of Athena, which is in the philosophic dialogues of Plato. These are three ways of getting ecstasis, not in the stasis of the balanced mind, but in the ecstatic ecstasis of the wild spirit, which the mind thinks is irrational, but which the spirit in its higher dimension considers freedom. And so one of the things that has come up in 20th century science is a deeper, on maybe 8 or 9 orders deeper than Pythagoras in our own lifetime, of a reiteration of all of this so deep that there is now a deep concern among people who can understand this, that unfortunately is not teachable, because there was no way to convey this without Plato's paideia, as they used to call it, not just the education of someone about subjects, but the paideia was the education of the whole civilization and the whole context of all of us together, so that it could be raised to that higher dimension where visionary consciousness was not considered irrational, but was considered the harbinger of a kind of a divine freedom of spirit. What has happened in the world of physics? This is lecture notes in physics, published in Berlin, Heidelberg, New York, and Tokyo. It's titled Effective Lagrangians in Quantum Electrodynamics. Joseph Lagrange was a French mathematician at the time of the French Revolution, along with Fourier and others. They were geniuses at transformation. What is interesting is that when we turn to the preface, just the first paragraph, and then we're going to turn to page 1 and read the first paragraph, and you'll see immediately that this was published in late 1984 and was on a cutting edge then of mathematical physics. With these notes, we would like to provide an introduction to the subject of effective Lagrangians for quantum electrodynamics, QED. Although this topic is interesting in its own right, it also provides us with an example of several important calculational techniques of QED, which are usually not found in standard texts. Moreover, studying vacuum problems in QED, where matters are fairly well understood, can be a helpful preparation for similar considerations in quantum chromodynamics and other more complicated theories. In contrast to the latter, electrodynamics has the advantage that many calculations can still be done analytically. Whereas in the further development that was just really new at this time, quantum chromodynamics, it's not ascertainable whether the analytic has run itself through completely or not. One of the problems is immediately in the first paragraph of the introduction. The problem of the existence of a stable electron dates back to the very beginning of electrodynamics. Electrodynamics is the movement, the dynamic properties and relations of an electron, of electrons. The problem of the existence of a stable electron dates back to the very beginnings of quantum electrodynamics. And there are whole books of literature now showing the development of quantum electrodynamics in its initial heyday, the 1920s and 1930s, all of a sudden blossomed after the Second World War by the genius of Richard Feynman and a couple of his buddies into something that by the early 1980s had led to a stupendous realization of scale. The sentence completes, if it is assumed, if the electron, the stable electron, is assumed, on one hand, to be an extended charge distribution, a negative charge that's distributed, it is unstable due to the repulsive electrostatic forces. Two negative electrons will repel each other. And so if you have a universe full of a field of extended electrons, they're going to all be unstable all the time. There will be no stability whatsoever. Now the kicker. On the other hand, if one assumes a point charge, the electron is a point of negative charge as a particle, one finds a divergent self-energy. Put simply, the math shows both ways that you run into problems of infinity all the time, everywhere. And one of the deepest things that we're learning is that that problem of infinity is not a problem any more than irrational numbers were 2,500 years ago. It's an indication of a dimensional constituent of reality. But we have to educate ourselves to get emergent through enough phases of maturity to be able to not just experience that, and not just to know that for certain, but to be able to explore it in an infinite fashion. And the upshot of this is that the maturation of consciousness is not a natural cycle. It is a complement to nature, and it is an ecology of consciousness, and that it has higher dimensions than nature has. The integral nature has 4 dimensions. And it is not so much that it's just stable within that, but that its objectivity is iterative. That means it's vibrating all the time. That means something like particles or atoms or cells are not just there and then they stick there and stay there, but they keep re-emerging constantly, shimmering in their emergence, like cells are constantly modifying and repairing and changing and making new ones and getting rid of old ones. And so the whole process, even down to the subatomic level, even down to the constituents of subatomic parts. And this is where quantum chromodynamics comes in. Just mention it so you can see how far things have come. About 1996, this volume on QCD, quantum chromodynamics, and the great collider physics, how it came into a very interesting kind of scale of something so small that it was almost impossible initially to believe that it could be existent. And one of the difficulties is that its existence can only be described initially by a mathematics that allowed you to assume that you could take a fictitious mathematical representation of it and work with it, and then when you got the approximation from the fictitious mathematical operations, one could take that and change it, renormalize it, bring it back into nature, so that there's a whole development of the issue associated with quantum electrodynamics of renormalization. That the only way to do initially the math was to do it in such a way that you were working with fictitious possibilities, and now you had to renormalize them so that you would have something that you could quantify, that you could count. This was a very difficult thing. By the time one went below the scale of subatomic particles to quarks and gluons and their lattice structure, notice that they have a crystalline structure, lattice, but they're not crystalline in any static way. They are rather the quark-gluon plasma. But this plasma is so minute that it only takes place in the primordiality of the field out of which a particle will come, and then the quarks with the gluons will make a subatomic particle like the proton and the neutron, and that these particles then are of a family called hadrons. And when one works with hadrons, one is working on a scale that is the universe completely within the infinitesimal inside of a subatomic particle. And that the odd thing is that the gluons do not count at all in terms of mass. They have zero mass, none whatsoever. And that the quarks have a very peculiar kind of equality. The man who named quarks was Murray Gell-Mann at Caltech. And he was a physicist that worked down the hall from Richard Feynman. And at the time, he was trying to read James Joyce's complex novel Finnegan's Wake. And so when they discovered this subatomic level, he named them quarks because in Finnegan's Wake, James Joyce, making some kind of Irish pun about the incomprehensibility of the universe, said, well, a quark for Mr. So-and-so. And so Gell-Mann, when he named it quark, also came out with the realization that on that level, the quarks have a very peculiar quality. They're never whole. They're always either 1/3 of something or they're 2/3 of something, but they're never whole. They're never one. They're never integral at all. And so they have to work together in order to emerge and become something. So if you have anything that has a quark structure that will hold long enough to keep the iteration stable, you'll always have a pair of them. But the pair sometimes involves not a 2/3 and a 1/3, but 2 2/3, which gives you 3/3. So you have to have a third one to come in. And so all of a sudden, on this level, one gets caught in the old I Ching symbolism. While you can have a pairedness in a polarity in nature, in order for it to really occur on the mysterious level that is below existence and in the mystery of nature, you have to bring a third element in. And what that third element is Tao. And Tao, as the third element, comes into play with the two aspects of what comes to be. In Chinese, the word is Te, but the Te is always, though it's a unity of pairs that belong together, yin and yang. And if you have yin and yang and Tao, when Tao works with it, it doesn't work to stay in the balanced polarity of yin and yang, but it works mysteriously through them, and that throughness of them creates a process which the Chinese call qi, energy, qi. So qi is the dynamic of Tao once it has gone through the goalposts of yin and yang held in some kind of a stability, and that qi, that qi, has an odd property, a very, very odd property, that it is, though it is a product of the three, actually there are just two stages. There's Tao, where it is only its mysterious movement itself. Then there's Te, which is the yin and yang together. So the Tao going through the Te produces a third state, and the Chinese word for that is Zhen, human-heartedness. The heartedness of our kind is the key of the mysterious Tao that has come through our yin-yang proportional. And that proportional, if it is held in such a way that it is balanced, the Tao will come through without giving any kind of a favor to yin or yang, but it carries the two together in their unity into Zhen in such a way that Zhen is even-toned. Whereas if the imbalance is that the yang is too much or the yin is too much, the Tao coming through it will be skewed in such a way that it will magnify and create problems. And so one wants to balance yin and yang, so when the Tao comes through as qi, one's human-heartedness, Zhen, will have a balance to it. But here's the kicker. Tao cannot be given a number, and so it is a zero. So that Te certainly is unity, one, so that yin and yang together are not whole, they're not ones, together they are one, so that Zhen is two. Though it's in the third phase, it's a two. And one can see, because the Chinese were just as accurate as the ancient Greeks, they understood too. We're dealing with something that is not irrational, but they called it supernatural. Yeah, there's something supernatural about man. When he is really balanced, when he or she is really balanced, they have a peculiar quality that they're able to engender in their symbolic minds a new phase, a new state. The symbolic state, and those symbols, the word for it is I, I. And so the I Ching is the book of the I, the book of the symbols. And what the symbols will be, though they're in the fourth phase, they are definitely a three quality, which gives them a kind of a geometric stability in that if you have just two, you can have a line. If you have three, you can have a triangle. You can have the beginnings of a form, and it can generate a three-dimensional, not a three-dimensional triangle like a pyramid only, but it can generate a sphericality, a trigonometric function form. And so the Chinese understanding, like the ancient Greek understanding, was that there is a fifth phase, the quintessential phase, but that fifth phase is a transform of the first four. And so you have an alchemy. And both the Egyptian Greeks and the Chinese were developers of alchemy. And that visionary consciousness must be an alchemical dimension that is able not only to rearrange natural integrals, but to transform them, and that the transformation has no limit because, well, the binary of nature of an integral is 0 and 1. If you're going to put a binary on consciousness, it's 0 and infinity. Let's take a little break. Let's come back to our maturation. The headline point is that as long as we stay mental, we are going to truncate reality to what we can manage with the indexing that we have been instructed in. And that kind of a limitation is not a limitation that just stays put. Nothing in this universe stays put. But it reiterates, it vibrates, it pulsates, and not because of any virtue that it has, but that this is the nature of integrals in the natural cycle, to do so. But because it is not growing, because it is not expanding, and because it cannot stay static in a stasis, a status quo technically will start to slide into regression all by itself. It's a universal happening. And one of the things is that the energy of emergence will even push a regression so that it doesn't just slide into regression, but it increases its regressiveness. And so you get a devolution. And the devolution will register and it will stop at some level or state where it can get some kind of stability. Now, if you're stopped up in the mind and that starts to have a regression, it starts to slide and increases and picks up momentum and speed. The regression cannot stop an experience because experience is a process and not a form. And so it will gather in a regressive way the images and the feelings and the language of the mythic horizon of experience, and it will lodge itself at the first objectivity that can come to, and that's the body. Not just the physical body, but that as well, but at the body of the ritual actions that one does in order to maintain one's existence. And so it isn't like a regression into materialism. That's a phony way to talk about it. Materialism is an ideology, a prizing the material over the immaterial, etc. And it isn't just the body, but the body does then receive the brunt of the negativity. But the real kicker in the works is that what receives the full momentum of the regression is that one's ritual actions become karmic and almost radioactive in that sense, that you become afraid to do anything different from what is the fundamental, bare minimum, basic. And then you are not only caught in that, but that you are available to be manipulated in that condition. And because you don't see anything beyond just what you're forced to do, to keep alive, to keep yourself going, to not rock the boat, to fit in, you will take the most forceful direction on your ordering. And so people who are capable of engendering a powerful ideology are very happy with you, because that kind of a population is easily shaped, not just in manipulation, but shaped to any degree of specificity that they deliver. One of the earliest scientific discoveries of this principle was discovered by Benjamin Franklin vis-a-vis electricity in the 1750s, 250 years ago. He discovered that these jars that were made in Leyden, Holland, that everyone was using at the time to experiment with electricity, the jars would have metal covering on the outside, and on the inside they would be filled with water or with the shot, little tiny shot from guns. And there would be a wire in a cork at the top of it. And if one introduced electricity, the jar would store electricity. And the question up until Franklin was, how does this happen and what does happen? And to make a very complicated, long series of experiments, which Franklin did and made him world famous at the time. He was the most famous scientist after Newton in the world. He discovered that there was equal minus charge on the outside and an equal positive charge on the inside, but that the charges were misstated because it wasn't that the charge was on the outside, on the negative pole, and it wasn't that the charge was inside. He was able to take the outside wrapping and show that it didn't have the electrical charge. He was able to empty the liquid, the water, or the shot, and show that you could put in fresh water and there would still be the charge there, so that the charge was in the glass of the bottle itself, not at the poles of the charge. And then he found that it wasn't the shape of the bottle, the shape of the glass at all, that it was just glass because it was a non-conductor, because it was a zero conductor. It held the polarity into its full force indefinitely. And if you insulated little panes of glass with little tiny spacers of lead, and he knew all about little spacers of lead because he was a printer. And in the 1700s, printers put letters into a little composite stick, and in between each word you would have a little lead spacer so that there would be the word. And so he knew all about making little lead spacers to make language printable, coherent. And so he took little panes of glass with little lead spacers, and he made the world's first electrical battery. And he showed that that battery will hold completely the amount of electrical force that is put into it for a very long time, and you can use that battery to operate things and work with things. And it was the beginning of the electrification of civilization. In a way, the zeros of the lead give a expressive context and background within which the form that has the oomph and force is able to not only absorb it and maintain it, but to also give it back out. And so it was Franklin who discovered that there is a universal principle here with electricity, with electrical energy. He at first thought it must be some electrical fluid, because it was a difficulty of finding just how does this, what is it? Some mysterious fluid. Later on, a little man who originally was the floor sweeper of an institute in London named Michael Faraday was the one who discovered that it is an electromagnetic force that actually works. And from Franklin to Faraday, the next step was James Clerk Maxwell, who figured out the math of the electromagnetic spectrum and how it works, and that it works by absorption and emission with a capacity to hold a stability of equilibrium in between the absorption and the emission, so that the electromagnetic reality of the universe actually has two modes that have an equilibria spacer where they meet. There's an integral and there's a differential. There's an absorption and there's an emission. And they are held not by anything, but they are held by the perfect equilibria of the two processes. And this goes back to the ancient yogic technique of samadhi. A samadhi is not done by controlling your breathing in or controlling your breathing out, but by controlling the cycle of breathing. And the cycle of breathing is that after you have breathed in so far, there will be, however short, some kind of a nanosecond of pause that you have stopped breathing in and you have not yet begun to breathe out. And prana, yoga, originally, one could enlarge that little nanosecond of the pause so that you would have an equal duration in experience time of breathing in, pausing, breathing out. And it was discovered that not only is there a pause in between breathing in, pause, then breathing out, but breathing out also has a pause, but instead of that pause being in you, the pause was in the world at large. So it was discovered in very high-powered yoga that one could not only balance breathing in and breathing out so that they had an equilibrium of complete rest yogically within oneself, but that could be paired with the complete rest of the universe. So that now, not only did you live by your breathing, but you spiritualized your living by entering a new coordinate of your yogic calm with the calm of the universe. And when you had both those coordinates together, now you had a possibility of having yourself not only fit into nature, but to fit into the entire natural cycle as a whole. That the entire cycle of nature now became a oneness. And when it did, the slightest little bit of consciousness would transform not only you, but the entire cycle of nature for you. And that if you took that equilibria, where you used the breath of breathing in and breathing out for language, the essence of language is being able to say a word which names. In Sanskrit, it's called nama, because it's an Indo-European language. The ability to name is nama. The ability to breathe in such a way that you yogically hold the pause within with the pause of the universe is called prana. And so the two coordinates together are called prananama. And it was Patanjali in the Yoga Sutra who classically showed that if you speak In the state of complete balance of prananama, what you say will transform the entire natural cycle. So a very powerful yogi can speak a word of truth and it will become real in the universe. That what is said is done. That the word now is a spiritual word, and this is why great spiritual yogis very often could be called the Word. Now you can recognize in this an ancient wisdom, an ancient technique, but when it starts to resurface, it resurfaces in contemporary science, late 20th century and now early 21st century science. More and more it emerges that there has been a second kind of a distillation that has happened. The first way in which that prananama gained its efficacy was to have consciousness as a fifth dimension enter into the ability to speak a creative word which would take registry not only in things of the nature but in the entire integral of nature. And since the mind is the ultimate integral center, the first thing that was changed completely was the mind. So that the mind changed from what to what? It changed from a closed circuit cycle to an open, circuitless infinity. And so Sri Aurobindo once called it the mind of light. One now does not have a mind of images, but a mind of complete light by which any imagery of any kind can be seen, not just visible light, or ultraviolet light, or infrared light, or radio waves, or gamma rays, but one is able to see the complete electromagnetic spectrum plus its complement, the magnetoelectric spectrum, whose iteration is about 10 billion times that of the electromagnetic spectrum. If you were a conscious being in the magnetoelectric spectrum, you could walk through the electromagnetic universe without touching a single subatomic particle, however small, including quarks, because the iteration is that refined. What happens in contemporary theoretical physics is that if the mind dreams up the ideas, you have a natural limit on it that is very difficult to work with, and you have to fudge things because the symbols that have been developed by the closed mind can only just barely reach a little bit of consciousness. It's like if you base your frame of attention on the body, on physiology, the furthest that you can go is just adding a little bit of visionary consciousness. So if you use drugs or pharmacology or herbology or food or asanas, normally the only way that you can go is just a little bit into conscious vision, because you're still holding on to a body base, a ritual base, an existential base. But if you let go of that existential base and you let it shift so that the base is no longer in ritual existential form, karmic finite action form, from the objectivity of this world, the next phase that comes into play is experience, which can, because it's a process and not a form, it can receive a modulation not only of being modulated with nature, but experience, the mythic horizon of that process, can modulate itself with visionary consciousness. Because experience, in our depth and complexity of it, is able to follow either the process of nature or the process of consciousness equally well. And if it follows nature, it looks back to the basics. If it follows consciousness, it looks forward to the possibilities. And so now experience is available for a monumental second kind of a transformation. The first transformation is to modulate experience with consciousness, myth with vision, so that those two processes now are in sync just as much as experience and nature were in sync. And one can check it out, yes indeed. When my experience is, as the French say, au naturel, I'm right into the universe. When my experience is in a special kind of complementarity sync with consciousness, I'm now at home in a wider universe called the cosmos. And I can see that what I need to do here is to transform the body as a base into a new possibility of a further future base, and that further future base is to emerge a new form. That is the form of the artistic person in their spirit. So that now one's mind, in between the modulation of experience and consciousness, understands that it has a referentiality not only back to the body and existential things, but also forward to works of art, to forms of spirit, to forms of the person. And so the person is able to emerge not as an idea of individuality in the mind, but as an aspiration of the open mind to achieve a new objectivity, which requires a creative transformation. And so persons are always emerged out of a creativity. They're not made, they're created. And they have a self-created quality. And when they do, now you have a very interesting kind of an equilibrium. You have an equilibrium of experience and consciousness, two processes. You have an equilibrium of forms, the form of the symbolic mind and the form of the artistic person. And with that equilibrium, just like the pranayama, when one has that kind of maturity, where you're at home in the art of the person and the excellence of the expanded experience and the synergy of the symbolic mind in a complementary with the aesthetic presence of the spirit, now a new kind of happening occurs, just like Tao going through yin-yang of Te, making Qi. The Tao that goes through that balance of the symbolic mind and the artistic person, of experience and consciousness, when that energy goes through that equilibrium, the key that comes out is historical consciousness. Very much a transform of something which is already enormously capable, dynamic, namely consciousness. Historical consciousness gains an ability to not only emerge through that equilibrium, but to initiate an ecology of consciousness that wasn't there before. And that ecology of consciousness is called civilization. Civilization is a verb. And civilization is not like a big culture. It's not a pastiche of different cultures where everyone is tolerant of each other or intolerant of each other. A civilization is at least symbol, vision, art, history, 4 orders beyond a culture. The cultures are still valuable, no doubt whatsoever, and they're a part of the cycle of nature. But they would be limited automatically by a phenomenon called periodicity, which is essential in integral nature. Not only periodicity, but of symmetry. One of the beautiful little phrases in Roger Penrose's The Road to Reality, page 54, he's talking about the real number system. That rational numbers are not enough. One has to have real numbers. And real numbers include not only irrational numbers, but imaginary numbers, many other kinds. And so one doesn't have just arithmetic of counting, one has a mathematic of visioning. And where the integral mind would be able to order by arithmetical techniques and indexing, when one has differential consciousness, now your ability is to transcend the limitations of arithmetic things, of numerical things, and go into a whole new development. Both the arts and the sciences are far beyond arithmetic. One now, in the Pythagorean terms, the community had those who came in to experience the quiet of not speaking when they really don't know that what they're saying, questions or answers or anything, is irrelevant eventually, so that they maintained a quiet for 5 years whenever they were being taught. And those who were quiet were not quiet dumbly, but they were quiet learning how to hear. And they were called acousmatiki, those who are learning to hear. If you learn initially by diagrams to see, the mind already has co-opted all those options, sealed them off, and brought them in. But hearing is still open, and it's easier to learn how to transform into consciousness by hearing than it is by seeing. And after becoming an acousmatiki for an incubation time, one learned that you could see, not in your mind, but that with your consciousness you began to see, and those were called mathematiki. And what they saw were not images, not ideas, but they saw theories of possibilities of images, of possibilities of ideas. So that you could, in the theoretic capacity of differential consciousness, you could create the ability to turn images around and turn their ratios around and turn their possibilities around and explore theoretically any development that you would like to explore whatsoever. And so the theoretic consciousness becomes the basis for eventually science. Theory is not the same as the mind. In fact, the techniques in ancient wisdom were very clear. Prayer is meant to purify the heart. Meditation is a technique to order and clarify the mind. But contemplation is the ability to see into more and more the visionary consciousness. One of the nicest presentations of it is in the great American Indian classic Black Elk Speaks. And when Black Elk is in a visionary mode, he's performing in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in Europe, and he's missing his people, the Oglala Sioux, and he goes into a visionary state. And in the visionary state, he becomes like a spirit bird that's able to fly over the earth and fly over the Black Hills where his people are. And he learns he's like this spirit eye of a great eagle. And the more that he looks at anything, the closer it comes and the more he can see into it. And he sees in this teepee painted with the designs of his family that his mother is dying, and that one of the reasons was that her spirit was calling out for him to go into this kind of a transform. Theoretical consciousness has the ability to go however small or however large you choose to explore, as long as you keep not your concentration so much on it, but that you keep the equilibria so that it is open to let the key come through as visionary consciousness. And one can see more and more and more and more. But it becomes magnified both telescopically and microscopically by historical consciousness. Because with historical consciousness, you now have the ability to not only see what is presenced there in your person, but you're able to see presciently what is analytically available were you to be able to look at the wholeness of the cosmos. And so science is literally the exercise of the prescient forms of cosmic adventure and exploration. So the aesthetic presence of the artistic spirit and the analytic prescience of the scientific form have a resonance together. And they have a resonance which is interesting because it is able to rise above the limitations of both the mind and of experience and of ritual, so that karma no longer has a hold, and experience is no longer limiting because one can introduce into experience the quality of experiment. Now it isn't just the experience that you've had or that someone else had and you accepted, but you can experiment with any aspect of it and discover new kaleidoscopic possibilities within that experience, and you can learn many orders of things at the same time beyond what you could have before. I often used to say in the early days that if you do this cycle, you'll raise your IQ 10%. And every cycle you do it, you can raise all of that 10%. Just a way of quantifying that what happens is an expansion which is across the board. And after a couple of cycles of this, you realize that instead of having just a population of people that had an average IQ of 120, the average would be about 160, about genius level, on an average. And it has nothing to do with royalty. It has nothing to do with gender. It has to do with having done it. Having gone through that maturation of not just a cycle, but an ecology as well. And having combed it out so that the ecology is able to interface with the cycle in such a way that it increases the ability to absorb and to emit, both at the same time, as well as it deepens the equilibrium. The ancient word for it is usually translated as meditation, or sometimes the English word is concentration. In Sanskrit, the word was dhyana. Dhyana. Dhyana is superior to dharma. Dharma is a truth that the mind is able to integrate and to understand and to cognize. But dhyana is a concentration that is able to open up recognition so that it can move beyond cognition, to open up realization to the real, to take the individuality of the mind's self-concept and open it up to the kaleidoscopic possibilities that you may be several billion facets of a life without end. And in this way, one becomes a jewel. One is not here as the character of your experience or the figure of your actions or the individuality of your thoughts. Those are there as well. But all of those and each of those and in their combinations are open to possibilities without end. This is called, in the ancient Chinese tradition, the return to Tao. In the Western tradition, it's called eternity. Life eternal, without end. Here on page 54, Penrose states something which is extraordinary. That the Greeks were forced into by realizing that a triangle in a square of 1 by 1, the hypotenuse will be the square root of 2, which is an irrational number. But look here. He says, we're prepared to allow that the ideal Platonic mathematical number could certainly require that the decimal expansion continues indefinitely. This applies, of course, even to the decimal representation of most fractions. For a fraction, the decimal expansion, however long it is, one begins to notice that the decimal expansion is always ultimately periodic. Every time you have a fraction, 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, 29/12, 237, 148, any fraction in the universe will have, in its decimal expansion, always an ultimate periodicity, which means that it is subject to an integral cycling, which would only be evident if you could go fine enough into your experiment so that your observation is not just experience, but now is more and more refined experiment, and one begins to notice. Then he says, decimal expansions were not available to the ancient Greeks, but they had their own ways of coming to term with irrational numbers. In effect, what they adopted was a system of representing numbers in terms of what are now called continued fractions. And the reason for this is that Greek mathematics, even all the way through the Pythagoreans, even up to Plato, Greek mathematics was based on Egyptian mathematics. And the Egyptian mathematics had an amazing genius of a severe limitation. Egyptian mathematical, integral, symbolic intelligence could find 2/3 of any number, but it couldn't move beyond that. And so they would take various manipulations of 2/3s of 2/3s, and they would work with this. If you get interested, Dover Paperbacks is reproduced by Fred Giddings, The Mathematics of the Ancient Egyptians in paperback. It harkens back to a limitation that is built into the integral of the natural cycle. And it shows up not only in numbers, it shows up in all life forms and all inorganic forms as well. They go so far and then they repeat. They don't go beyond that. They cycle, but they stay within the cycle. They do not go outside of the cycle. The only way to emerge from a cycle is through a double transform. And when the first transform happens, you gain not only freedom from the cycle, but you gain the freedom to have a transform of that transform. Not only the water into wine, but to transform the wine into cognac. And that second transform transforms freedom into infinity. And so what you get in modern theoretical physics, now the cutting edge of the 21st century, is there's such a thing as asymptotic freedom. Freedom that becomes freer and freer and freer the more that it is brought into form. The freedom goes asymptotically off the chart. There's no end to it. It's not only complete freedom. It's not total freedom. It's not perfect freedom. It is infinite freedom. This is the quality of reality. More next week.